Welcome to the Earthworks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Earthworks podcast. This is kind of a turning of the tables today, I guess, that I'll be interviewing my boss, Joel Simmons. We're going to go over a few things and probably end up in the weeds and on rabbit trails all over the place, but had a couple things that I wanted to ask him about that might shed a little light on the history of the company, kind of where we came from, where we are now, and maybe where we're going in the future. So Joel, thanks for setting this up, I guess.
A little strange being on this side of the desk.
Yeah, a little bit. Well,
you've been on this side of the desk with me, but I've never been on this side of the desk.
That's right.
Kind of interesting.
So the things I want to cover, I guess I want to start with kind of the history of the company. I think you've told this story a little bit before, but your chance meeting of Jerry Brunetti, how that all transpired, and you know how it evolved into what it is today. So start at the start.
Start at the start with Jerry Brunetti. It's actually kind of funny, and I don't know that I've told this story on the podcast, but it's a story I tell often. I was the county extension agent here where I'm sitting in Easton, Pennsylvania, in Northampton County, Pennsylvania. So as a county extension agent, my job was to get around the county and visit with people. And so I was a single guy. I was in my early 20s and, came into a town. I was living in this town of Bethlehem in Easton. Didn't know many people. And they gave me a county car and said, go visit people in the neighborhood and try to help them out. So one of the people that I got to know early on, and it's actually kind of a funny story because I was told, I'm going to tell the long story if you're okay with that. I was told one of my very first days that I had to select a specialty as an extension agent. I had to become a specialist in some field. So of course, my first thought was turf. Oh, no, that's taken. Oh, okay. Well, how about landscaping? Oh, that's taken. And I went down this laundry list and they kept telling me that they were all taken. And I said, all right, so what isn't taken? And he goes, well, there's a budding industry. There's a budding grape growing industry in our county and in the state, actually, at that time. And he said, there's a gentleman by the name of Mr. Charles Flatt, who has a winery in the county. And they just happen to have a wine meeting, a wine growers meeting that night at one of the wineries. And he said, why don't you go and introduce yourself to Mr. Charles Flatt and get involved with the wine growers. And I'm like, oh, that would be exciting. I could be a wino and look at me now. I'm a professional wino. So I go to this meeting and I'm expecting, my vision of this gentleman was an older gentleman driving an older Mercedes-Benz that was yellow, and he had a long coat on with a fedora. That's what I had in my head. And I get there and I meet this young lady who was relatively attractive, and she introduces herself as Elaine Flatt. And I said, oh, well, you must be Mr. Charles Flatt's daughter. It was his wife, and he was a 30-some-year-old hippie and just a phenomenal guy. And he and I became very close, as did the whole family. And I would spend many of my Friday afternoons, and as he would tell the story, and unfortunately we lost Charles a number of years ago, but he would tell the story that he would come home. He was a high school teacher, and he would come home on Friday afternoon tired from a long week's work. And there was the county agent's car, and there was the county agent sitting in his chair with his wife drinking his wine. And I would say, well, come join us. And we became very close friends. He taught me an awful lot about the grape growing industry. And it was just this little farm up on the hill. And we worked pretty closely together and became good friends. But like I said, I actually became the state wine specialist in Pennsylvania as a county agent, or one of the state specialists. But the long story short was at some point after knowing him for a while, he said, you've got to meet this guy. He's really, really brilliant, but I have no idea what he's talking about most of the time. And that gentleman was Jerry Brunetti, who earnestly taught, I got to know Jerry. Jerry had already started his company Agrodynamics and was dealing with animal health care and soils management. And Jerry was one of the, and you were one of the few people here in our company that got to really know Jerry a bit anyway, seeing him speak. But Jerry was very patient, and for some reason he took a liking to me, and but he spent many years helping me to be de-educated. So he taught me, that everything I learned about pH and all that stuff wasn't quite necessarily the case, and just he had such a way in which to communicate that was not aggressive and helped me really discover a lot of things. So we became very close friends over those years. I was an extension agent. I'd left extension because I think I was making, when I left after 5 years, I was making $12,000 in the mid 80s, and I had a $10,000 student loan bill. That's kind of, the math doesn't work real well. And I had a friend that said, look, I was hanging out with this college roommate, and we were going into New York and listening to jazz and stuff, and he had to pay because $12,000 doesn't pay for a lot of beers in New York City. So I've made this a very long story, and you're
even
now,
back in the 30s when you were
exactly.
This, right?
Now you're very saddened that you actually asked me this question, but as it turned out, after a number of years I was a recruiting manager, wasn't really enjoying it, wanted to get back into horticulture, and Jerry and I had stayed close, and he had suggested that we get together and do some work, and I said, sure, I'd love to get back into the business a little bit. So we actually started with the idea, and I'm going to show you something, and I think I showed it to you this morning on me, but this is our first business plan. And basically what this said was, we're going to be a franchise lawn care company. And we had formulated two products that you know now well, and many of our clients know, 545, which is our biggest selling granular, and our soil conditioner we call Kick. So we had formulated those to be a part of this business that we were going to build, that was going to be a lawn care service. I was going to go out and apply 545 and use Kick as the soil conditioner on customers' lawns. And then after I quit my job and given up everything I had, I woke up and called Jerry and I said, I'm a little nervous about this. Why don't we just sell these things instead of being a lawn care company? And he, of course, said to me, he goes, I've been trying to tell you that for 6 months, you dummy.
And that was in the late 80s.
I was in the late 80s, yeah. I was 6 years old at the time, and nobody seems to believe that story. I don't know why.
So clearly the market was flooded with organic-based products.
Oh yeah, there was a whole lot of nothing there.
You were just jumping on the train at that point.
It was, it's funny you say that because, and you and I have talked about this over the years, but the organic thing was happening in a lot of situations. But until we really got into the heart of turf management, it wasn't really a thing at all. I mean, it was a struggle for the first 5 or 6 years. I mean, we were called every name in the book. Lawn care, we actually had some modest success with the lawn care companies because we were doing the right thing. We were trying to sell it not as being an organic lawn care company, but we were selling it as a amendment to the soils program. And I didn't know this at the time, but Jerry did. He knew that these products would actually help us reduce inputs. And I didn't understand it. I mean, I literally, when I got into this business with Jerry, I had no idea about how to run a business. I didn't know much about the agronomy of what we were doing. I mean, I was really leaning on Jerry's expertise, and he'd had 15 years or so in the business and understood it. And obviously working with farmers, so turf was new to him too. But there's so many things that I had no idea as to what to expect. And I didn't really know even how the products would perform. And it took me a couple of years to really see that firsthand, that I got to work with, lawn care companies. And I tell this story. Now, this is back in the late 80s, early 90s. We didn't have computers. So, the first thing that I did, I didn't know anything about running a business. I'd never been a businessman. And I was just running scared. I just didn't want to have to, go back to working somewhere else or sell shoes in the mall or something, So the first thing I did was I went to, and I'm going to age myself here, but I went to the library with a bag of dimes. Why do you ask a bag of dimes? Because back in the late 80s and early 90s, it cost you 10 cents to photocopy something. So I went to the local library. And what is the library, you ask? That's that place where they keep books, or at least they used to before. And nobody really seems to know that anymore. But in the library, they had phone books. What is a phone book, you ask? That's that big thing that had everybody's advertisement in it. And boy, I am aging myself. And I copied every single page of every lawn care company that I could find in the tri-state area, and I cold called them all. And we did okay. I mean, the first few years we survived. I mean, we paid our bills, and I mean, we didn't make any money, but we paid the bills enough to keep the doors open, and had formulated a few products. And the guys that we were working with were starting to see some real value to what it was. And again, it wasn't even for those guys, and we didn't position it this way. It wasn't so much about being organic. It was really about changing the soil profile. But that much we knew when we got started. And back in those days, there was really two companies in the marketplace, maybe a few more, but two big companies. One was Emerald Isle, who was making kelp meal, and the other was Roots, which was using humic acids. And we both, Jerry understood both of those product lines, and obviously they're good product lines and good companies back in that day. And so he understood the importance of diversity of these formulas. So he started really putting together things that were extremely diverse and combined a lot of the stuff that was out there. So it was an interesting starting point. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing.
Right.
He did.
So with 545 and Kick, have those two formulas remained unchanged for the whole?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, they've changed only because of necessity, and we've moved from manufacturer. One of the biggest struggles that we had, in particular with the 545, is early on we were working with a manufacturing facility that was manufacturing for the agriculture community.
Right.
So the 545, which was the mainstay product, was incredibly dusty. So after a year or two of doing this, especially once we got into the golf course industry, when we were the first few years, Earthworks was primarily selling to lawn care companies. But through a friend, Tom Briner, who actually I've interviewed here on the podcast, I got to know Tom at Fiddler's Elbow, and I told that story on that podcast. But when we got into the golf course business, we realized really quickly that this really dusty product wasn't going to be very successful or very sustainable. In fact, I think I told this story on that podcast with Tom, which was one of my favorite podcasts because it was all about me. And, when it's all about me, it's always, right, a lot of fun. But he had a sales rep there he had a guy on his crew that was, spreading this stuff. And he was, he was talking about this as a very dusty product, and he would literally be covered up to his chest in this black, stinky material because it was, egg layer chicken with a lot of humic acid. It was very dark, and it stuck to your clothes, and it didn't smell real well. So it wasn't a pleasant experience. Finally, we were able to move on to manufacturing partners that were able to prill the product, and it moved the company exponentially into the future. So lots of strange gyrations of what we went through as a business in those early years.
So go back to lawn care for a minute. I mean, if you're jumping into the market in the late 80s, what's changed because a fair amount of our business is lawn care and landscape management. What's changed about that business and our relationship in it with it?
Well, one thing for sure is we've gotten better at being able to explain why we do what we do.
Right.
And as I said earlier, I mean, for some reason, it's been interesting because we really haven't changed much of our core at all since the very first day. And again, I would be the first to say I was as green as anybody could be in both business and even in the agronomics of it all. But Jerry wasn't. And again, he instilled in me the concept of, yes, this is organic, but that's not why we're here. We're not here to jump on a bandwagon of organics. In fact, if we didn't have to use the word organic, we tried not to. It was about changing the soil. And the things that we saw early on with the lawn care guys was that it did change the soils. When we got our products into the lawn care industry, and this was here in eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So we're in this mid-Atlantic 9-month season. By November, our lawns would start to go dormant. our products kept their lawns active well into a cool, winter. They'd go dormant last, and they were the first to come out of dormancy. And these are things that I didn't know when I got into it. I didn't know this was going to be something we'd see. But, the lawn care industry back then was still fairly small in their infancy. So, getting into golf course just from a business standpoint was a little bit easier for us. But what has changed since then is, to answer your question, the lawn care guys are savvy. They're business people. And what we try to talk to them about when we talk to lawn care is that this is going to change your business model. And most importantly, by producing a program that truly allows you to reduce inputs, which is what carbon-based fertility does. We reduce inputs, and I've said this many times on my podcast, but one of the things that I didn't know at the time either was that we are going to help clients reduce inputs, because the model of ChemLawn and the traditional lawn care model was 4 to 6 pounds of N, and our guys that we were working with were moving to closer to 2 pounds of N, sometimes even less. Right. And that's certainly been true, as you know, on the golf course side. So when you do the right things agronomically, inputs get smaller. So when you're talking to lawn care people, the conversation switches from agronomics to economics. And, we want to convince them or help them discover that by changing their business model from this a la carte model that literally encourages them to over apply, because every time they put something down, they put a bill on their client's desk. And now what we're trying to say is charge a flat fee. And then now you're in a position where you can start to truly reduce inputs, which is clearly better for their lawns, better for their environment, and absolutely better for their bottom line. Their margins go up, and that's what we're seeing fairly, strongly at this time. And in this year, it's been even more interesting because, as we've all seen, the price of nitrogen has gone up. We've had 3 or 4 price increases this year alone. So when those things happen, and that happened a couple of times in our 30 years, when those situations happen in the middle of the season, you get these nitrogen price increases, it really wakes people up to say, wow, maybe if I can pull back instead, and I can, at the end of the day, lawn care, is all about, profit margin, and it's a business conversation as opposed to an agronomic conversation. Although,
and one of the toughest hurdles that we seem to have to overcome with these conversations is analysis.
Right.
We're typically a low analysis, which to a savvy lawn care business person is more bags on the truck.
Right.
More product going out. But I think if you kind of pull back, and it seems to be a lot easier conversation if you pull back and say, look, as you invest in those soils, you are making fewer trips. Which is a terrible business model on our part.
Right. Well, that's what I've said from day one.
You'll end up using less.
Right.
Okay, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it does bear out.
And I told that story when I interviewed Tom Briner. Tom was my only customer at the time. I mean, he was my biggest customer, and we had written a plan for him, 4 applications, just because that's what we were taught in school, and that's what everybody thought, 4 pounds of N. And we got there, the second or third application, and he goes, I don't need it. I'm like, what do you mean you don't need it? I got bills to pay, dude. I mean, I got to get this money in here. And he drove me around, and I, looked at this property, and I was an eye opener. I mean, and again, this kind of really, talks to how green I was when I started this thing. I really just didn't, I didn't realize that to the extent. Jerry knew it. He just, he kind of let me discover things because he knew I was hard-headed. And if I didn't figure it out on my own, I was never going to know it. Yeah. Part of the patience that I had working with this brilliant guy, who was not only a great agronomist, but a wonderful human being. But until you actually see that, and this is true of our customers, until you really see it as a golf course superintendent or as a lawn care operator or as a sports turf manager, until you actually see the fact that what we're talking about with carbon-based fertility is you are going to reduce your inputs. And yeah, it kind of is a crappy model for us from a business standpoint, but it really isn't. I mean, it's what we've been hanging our hat on from day one. And, and our approach has always been, we'll continue to grow because more people will discover that, feeding the soil is really effective. And a lot of times with lawn care guys, it might be only one application that they put down a carbon-based fertilizer. It might be the dormant feed or the later feed, or it might be the early one. They're going to still do certain things that are going to be non-organic. I mean, they're going to put down their pre-emergences and do all those things. So you don't even need a lot. You just get an application in there, and that still allows you to even out your soils, makes the synthetics work better when you do use them, and it extends that season out exponentially, so you can start reducing inputs.
It provides the base for everything else to work better. Yeah. So I want to get back to Jerry, but I want to ask first, why the raw material? How did you two get to that? Why egg layer compost and not some other source? We have the conversation a lot about meal-based products and the fact that you can get analysis up, but why egg layer compost?
Well, once again, at the time, I had no idea. This was all Jerry. I have obviously since learned then, and I also learned how much he really knew. I mean, as I got in, and again, and you know me as well as anybody, I tend to be a little hard-headed on all that, but Jerry knew definitively that of all the raw materials, and quite honestly, what we were looking at the time potentially was sludge products, human wastes, meal products that you mentioned, and chicken manure. And of chicken manure or animal manures, there is a lot of different manures out there. The chicken manures are the most dense in terms of mineral. And he knew that he wanted to stay with egg layers. So we stayed with egg producing farms because sludge products have been pasteurized, homogenized. It's not a balanced fertilizer. But I'll tell you what, sludge products and even meal products would have been a lot easier to work with from simply a manufacturing standpoint. And there were many days when I cursed the whole idea of that we went down this road, because egg layer compost is not an easy product to deal with from a manufacturing standpoint. But the big difference is that the meal products, which are dense in nutrient, but there's not a lot of there's not a lot of mineral. And that was really what Jerry's real strength was. He really understood that if we're going to do good things to the soil, we have to remineralize. And he always was talking about remineralization. So when he looked at these three sources of raw material, he knew that egg layer waste, because of the raw materials that were going into that bird was going to drop a lot of mineral. I mean, and you and I have talked about it, and we've talked about it on our podcast. When we talk to our manufacturer now and we talk to the nutritionist, 80% of that material that they feed that bird, which is expensive, goes out the back end. And you've heard me say this. I sat down with a nutritionist at our plant, and he was complaining about the expense that they needed to get this much material into the bird in order to build the shells, because they're producing a product, and to keep the birds healthy. So there was a lot of inputs that went in, most of which come out the back end. And I'm like, oh, that's wonderful, because that's what we're trying to do. And that was what Jerry was trying to talk about, was that we want these minerals that have gone through a biological digestion in the bird. And because, chicken manure is pretty hot, we're not putting that on grass. It has to sit in a composting facility for a while. And he was very adamant too, that we work in a composting facility as opposed to what they call an in-vessel digester, which takes the manure and cooks it basically in 30 days and makes it a fertilizer. When you do that, you burn up a lot of the valuable carbon and you kill off a lot of the biology. So there was rhyme and reason to everything that he did. I wasn't sure I understood it at the time. I clearly do now, and hopefully you guys do. But we've got a lot of calcium, a lot of minerals, and 2 biological digestions going with this raw material that now comes into a into our processing plant that we can bag and give it to our clients. So it's a mineral dense, biologically active material, whereas meal products don't have a lot of mineral and they have no biological digestion. And obviously human wastes are pasteurized and yeah, because they have to be. And the value, the nutritional value on sludge is not good. You get a little nitrogen, about a 6%, and that's what you'll see that, but you won't see the kind of sustainability you get with a replenished product, an egg layer product. So there was rhyme and reason. I didn't know it at the time, but he did. And thank God I was able to at least sit back and say, okay, yeah, go, do it. And then he did the same concept with the liquids, is we always have very diverse formulas, but they were always very, very mineral dense. I mean, if you think about it, we grow a cover crop. So we're constantly demineralizing that soil. We're constantly pulling that mineral out of that soil, and we never replenish it. We're not turning the soil down like a farmer might be and flipping the mineral back up. So the only way we're going to ever remineralize the soil is to put it over the top. And, and a synthetic package isn't, when we're saying minerals, just to qualify that, we're talking about rock minerals or minerals that have, that are sustainable. They're not real available. But when they're in the soil, the plant can reach into that soil through the process of photosynthesis and this carbonic acid that goes through the root system and pulls that mineral out of the ground. The cover crop of a turf plant is constantly taking that mineral out. And again, as you well know better than anybody, we're top dressing or we're building out of sand. So there isn't a lot of mineral there anyway. That's the one thing. And if you read that book that's sitting over my left shoulder here, Jerry's book talks a lot about remineralization, and that was probably the biggest message that he instilled in me, and the importance of this. And we've stayed with that from day one. And like I said, it's not been easy. It's been a real struggle to manufacture and get this thing really right. But it's for a good reason. I mean, we it's the best raw material that we can use, and that was really the mantra that we always kind of went with, is, let's just do it as well as we possibly can. And he was a stickler for it. So thank God he was the brain trust in this company, because I might have ruined it all by then.
Well, and I think you hit on a pretty important point there, that especially in golf and sports turf, a lot of us are managing very sterile systems, and that's where the benefit really comes in with some of the formulations. All of the formulations, they're really geared towards a sterile growing medium like a sand-based.
And we didn't know that at the time when we built the company. I mean, Jerry didn't know anything about golf, and nor did I, for that matter. I mean, I said this in the podcast with Tom Briner. Tom Briner showed me what a fairway was, what direction you go off of a tee box. I mean, it was that bad. What's a ball washer? I mean, what's a club? I mean, It was, I'm exaggerating obviously, but it was pretty close to that. So we had no idea to what you guys as superintendents were dealing with in terms of all the level of agronomy. But once we started to understand that, these are sterile soils, these are soils made out of sand, we're even more important. I mean, we tell this story a lot. We've been working a lot in Florida in the last few years. But when we first started working in Florida as a business, we actually thought Florida would be a challenge for us as a business, because we thought it would take so much input to get any kind of reaction out of those light and low CEC soils with these carbon-based products. But in fact, it really was the exact opposite. They were so void of mineral and carbon that even that little bit of input was a big splash. And the same thing, when we started working on sand greens or sand athletic fields, the response was really, they were so starved for some food. The microbes are screaming, feed me, give me something. And it's always been a learning experience. I mean, I can say this very comfortably, of all the years that we've been doing this, I have yet to stop learning. And obviously spending 30 years with Jerry, I never stopped learning. And now, as we've been fortunate enough to work with Lawrence Mayhew. And as we go through as a team every Monday, listening to Lawrence talk, I mean, it's just masterful that we're always learning something, and it's thank goodness, right?
That's right. So, okay. So this is a question I don't know the answer to, and we've never talked about it. It didn't seem as though there was a subject that would stump Jerry at all, with the exception of maybe golf, I guess. But
right.
What was his education?
Oh, that's an interesting question. He went to university. He went to UNC and studied animal husbandry. Right. And this is going to sound. I want this to sound correct because he wasn't cocky in any way. But Jerry was self-learned. He was a vivacious reader,
right?
And he was extremely intuitive. I mean, he was an Italian kid from Alpha, New Jersey. Grew up in a Catholic school system. Alpha, New Jersey. If anybody knows this area, it's a fairly suburban area. It's not farmland, but he always had a passion for farming. And he went to University in North Carolina to study animal husbandry, and he got frustrated very quickly, and just didn't completely subscribe to all the things that he was being taught in that very conventional school, and he thought he could find a better way. He was reading people that influenced him in all sorts of directions, and literally till his last few days, Jerry was always a student and always a reader. And I mean, I would go to his house, and there would be literally on his coffee table 15, 20 new books that I'd never seen every time I'd go there. And I went there often. And many of which are now sitting here, but don't tell the Brunetti family that, because I probably have captured a handful of them myself. And they're fascinating. And some were really out there, but some were really very conventional. And some have now really become extremely conventional. But he ended up working, with a couple of folks. He ended up working with a dairy group here in Pennsylvania, and realized fairly quickly that it didn't make sense to him. The things that the conventional ag were promoting didn't make sense. And again, he had been studying people that, Dan Scow and people like this that just, made sense to him. And he followed that. And then he started seeing it in the field. And he was 10 years, 20 years ahead of his time. And quite honestly, the stuff that we're doing, I would still say is 10 years ahead of its time. And it's still Jerry, so he was just intuitive and a reader, he just figured it out.
So animal husbandry, the idea was to be a veterinarian or something along those lines.
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think he ever wanted to be a vet. But I think he had dabbled in with dairy, before he went to school, and he had an interest in the animals. He always had a passion for animals in general. I don't know that he wanted to be a vet, but I think he wanted to work on a farm, and he ended up working on a farm out of college. He never finished his degree. He was at that point where he just said, I'm going to just go and do this. And he did. And I'm not even sure. I know the answer to this, and I'm not sure if his family would. I'm not sure where he got his teeth cut on soils. Obviously, it was with the crowd at Acres and Dr. Albrecht's work, and that was one of the things that he taught me very early on. Of course, I'm the young kid county agent that knows everything about pH and doesn't know how to read a soil test, and he helped me, discover these things. And he helped me, and I still vividly remember some of these stories where he would show me soils that were balanced, and you could just see physically the changes. I remember him taking me. And I don't remember who the gentleman was, but it was one of his mentors. And we walked down between two farm fields, and on the left and on the right, two different farmers and completely different weed populations. And I had just come out of Penn State, so I knew everything about weeds and plant ID. That was probably one of the few things I did know.
Right.
So, he goes, well, what do you see over here? And I'd say this, this, and this. And he goes, well, what do you see over there? And I'd say, oh, it's a lot different. Like, well, how could that be? It's literally separated by a road, a narrow road, a 1-lane road. And I'm like, well, I don't know. How could that be?
You knew what to spray on it. You didn't know why.
Right. I didn't exactly.
Why that weed was there.
But, sure. On this one, it was a lot of plantains and clovers and dandelions. And this one was different plant material. And he goes, and of course I'm the county agent, so I'm the guy that does the soil testing. So he goes, take a soil test of this farm and then take one of this one and let's talk. And I would take a sample and they were radically different. And he goes, you can tell the soil by the population of the weeds. And of course I'm like, that's a bunch of crap, I'm just completely skeptical. And I took the test and I'm like, oh, wow, this old guy was dead on. And, Jerry would just kind of chuckle and, and we would see, and then he'd come back and tell me what this farmer was doing. He goes, he knew what his soil was and he was starting to modify it and change it. And that was the first experience I had with managing a soil to get the basic foundation of it changed. And then it got deeper than that. Obviously, the farmer that was doing the right soil stuff was adding compost and carbon to the soils, and it got to a point. I remember him taking me back to that farm in the middle of the hot, dry summer, and the I'll call it good farm and bad farm for sake of argument. The good farm was standing up pretty tall, and it was green, and this farm looked almost like a semi-arid desert. There just wasn't a lot there. Neither side were irrigated.
Right.
And it was striking. And these were the things that, when you see that stuff, when you can touch it and visualize it, it changes, at least if you have a brain, you're going to start asking the question, wow, that's interesting. How can that possibly be? And I'm still a skeptic. I was still a skeptic at the time. And, like I said, Jerry said he's always spent about 10 years de-educating me. And it took probably that, because I'm slow. I learned slowly.
And you know what? A lot of us were de-educated when we got out of school.
You were one of them?
One of them. Yeah,
exactly.
I was lucky enough to be influenced by Ed Miller and Armin Sooney and John Selinsky and a lot of those guys. And, they had jumped on or jumped off the bandwagon years before I did. But
exactly. And it's funny because when I first met you were in that little pocket of Arizona. I'd never been there before. And I guess I had met Ed Miller about the same time. And I was like fascinated because I now was starting to learn about, balancing soils. And here's this pocket of superintendents that all got it. I'm like, wow, I was like a kid in a candy shop when I met you and all the guys around you and Ed. And I hadn't met Armin at that point, but there was a half a dozen or more of you guys. I don't even know all their names anymore, but that were all kind of following this model in the desert in sand and realizing the limitations, but still making it work. And, and all of you, I don't know that I've ever met anybody in this industry that once they follow that soils approach has ever left it. Even with all the criticism and all the anti-base saturation conversations we have, the pseudoscience conversations, I've never met anybody that ever went down that road that got off of that path. And I don't know if you have, but you've been doing it as long as I have.
Yeah. No, it's there's limitations and exceptions, and that's
Absolutely.
One of my questions. But so maybe we'll get into that. So base saturation is kind of where this started, and we still do a lot of testing with that as the primary. Where doesn't that work? Because there are some soils and some situations where that doesn't work.
There's a lot of places it doesn't work. There's actually even heavy. Obviously the answer that you're kind of hunting for here is in these low CEC soils. And I've been preaching that, and Jerry preached that to me and to his clients. Of course, farmers, for the most part, are dealing with high CEC soils. They don't have these constructed sands. We know definitively, and we've always preached this and always worked hard to work around this, but we know that these low CEC soils, and I think we're probably now as a team in agreement that this low CEC number is probably somewhere around 6 to 8. So anything below, let's say for sake of argument, 8 CEC, anything below that, the numbers that Dr. Albrecht established way back in the 30s, they don't work. And he even knew that. He wrote articles. I even saw one of the naysayers publish this article that he wrote saying that, in low CEC soils, base saturation is not a tool that we necessarily follow. And certainly in constructed sand greens or fields. Base saturation isn't a model that we use. We've never used it for that. We will take a base saturation test, and we will use some of that data because it gives us organic matter, and it gives us pounds per acre, and it gives us pH, and it gives us, all at CEC, and it gives us some trace numbers. I mean, it gives us a lot of sodium. It gives us sodium. So it does a lot of information, but that's where we've evolved into going into more testing, the water-soluble paste extract. But even in certain soils, and Dr. Albrecht identified this, there's soils up by you in the upper West Coast, the upper Northwest. Some of those soils, which are different, base saturation doesn't work quite as well either. But we know, and I've been teaching this for most of my professional career in the academy when I was at Rutgers, and I've always worked with clients and with students and say, look, if you're dealing in a low CEC below 6 or 8, this model is not going to be what it is. But in soil, in a higher CEC, in a soil that has a CEC above 8, 12, 15, 20, if you've got a calcium deficiency and you've got an excessive amount of magnesium, adding limestone based on that model has never failed. In 30 some years that I've been doing this, it has never failed. And I can say very comfortably that it has changed the way the superintendent or the turf manager has looked at it, and we've seen the soil change. Now, the criticism is never ending. I mean, it still continues. This pseudoscience thing, or this is not real science, just look at minimum levels or whatever it is. I mean, it's just a bunch of crap. And the reality is that there's thousands of superintendents that across this country that live and die by this on higher CECs.
Right.
And again, here's one of my favorite is that, if you don't like your soil, just move. Well, that's silly. We're not changing the soil, we're managing the soil. So if your soil has a low calcium load and a high magnesium load, by adding a high calcium lime, you change that for a period of time. Will it revert back? Of course it will, if you don't continue to manage that. But in the process, what we're doing is affecting soil physics. As you know, the three-legged stool is chemistry, physics, and biology. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to impact the soil chemically so that we can get more air and water to move through it physically, because ultimately what we're really interested in is the biological piece of the soil, biological soil management, and getting that piece of the puzzle to work effectively. And that's where we start to reduce the inputs. But this silly argument about base saturation is pseudoscience, that's just people that are trying to control the message and don't have any idea what the message really is. And it's unfortunate because the Kevin Hicks of the world and the Ed Millers of the world, and you and I can name probably 1,000 superintendents that have understood for their career what balancing a soil can do for them. They also understand the limitations, and it does not work in sand. So we go to paste extract. So you just got me on my soapbox and I just ran with it. And I don't know if that was the answer you wanted to hear.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the, a couple of the things that we'll use the liming example here.
Yeah.
But a couple of the things that doesn't accomplish, it does as an effect, not a cause, but we're not liming for pH.
No, never.
The pH is what it is because of
the imbalance of the soil.
The imbalance.
Or the balance of the soil, depending on what you do.
And the other thing we're not doing is we're not feeding lime to our Poa annua on the fairways. It's not a plant nutrient specifically.
Right.
It's a soil amendment, right?
That's why we do it. And the other thing is we're not trying to sell limestone. I mean, that's one of my favorite arguments. And I hear this so many times. I've heard it very recently. The question that, that I love more than anything, or the comment that I love more than anything, is when academia or folks that think base saturation is this pseudoscience, my favorite criticism has always been, oh, they're just trying to sell calcium. I can assure everybody that, first of all, I don't sell limestone. I never have, and we never will, because it's a commodity. We
Right.
don't make money selling limestone, nor do any of our distributor partners. Anybody selling limestone, it's a true commodity, and it's probably one of the cheapest things in the world. So this criticism of saying, oh, they're just trying to sell fertilizers and prop. First of all, if you do the soil piece right, we're going to sell you less fertilizer. So quite honestly, doing this is probably stupid for us, because as a business, we sell
right.
less fertilizer, but we also don't sell, we don't sell calcium, we don't sell limestone. And I've had many an argument with my distributor rep partners, like, can you stop doing this? Like, this is a pain in the butt having to move all this. It's a big commodity. It's a truckload of stuff that they have to have. They don't make a dime on it. I mean, nobody's making money selling limestone,
Right.
and probably not even really selling gypsum. Although what you're asking me is, the model of adjusting this calcium. But I can assure you that if calcium is the limiting factor, it's going to be your first limiting factor. And on the soils that need calcium, and particularly the ones that have high magnesium, again, the base saturation model is one of 100%. So if you've got a full glass and you put something in it, something's coming out. Mm-hmm. So if I have a soil that has a lot of magnesium in it, which is tightening the soil and creating a real issue, I'm going to have I'm going to have an issue where I can actually drive that magnesium that's tightening that soil up and flocculate the soil. And again, going back to what we're suggesting is that if we can flocculate a tight soil, because a simple balance of the, of the chemistry, and again, looking over my shoulder here at Bill McKibben's book, The Art of Balancing Soils, it just fascinates me that we're still 30 years later, we're still getting criticized. Base saturation is pseudoscience. No, it's never failed in a high CE soil. It's not used on a low CEC USGA spec soil. So I understand why the USGA would be critical of base saturation. I really do. My problem is that we're not dealing with it on those low CEC soils. So again, my soapbox is big. I've been using it for a lot of years. Yeah. I might not have answered your question the way you asked me, but that makes sense.
That's a great explanation. So the three-legged stool: physics, chemistry, biology. Okay.
Chemistry, physics, biology, because chemistry affects physics, correct, affects biology.
Correct.
Sorry, I don't mean to correct.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm on the opposite side of the stool, so I was looking at.
There you go. Oh, I see. That's right. It's just how your perspective.
Obviously, a lot of what we're focused on is biological soil management.
Yeah.
There's an old slide that we all use in our presentations of the two of you, much younger days,
with a porn stash. Yeah.
With it on the banner in your booth that says biological soil management. So how do we have the audacity to claim to be able to influence soil biology?
Because we affect the chemistry and we allow air and water to move through and we feed it. I mean, it's the old adage, and I believe that Jerry came up with that phrase, biological soil management. I think I came up with the phrase of balance the chemistry and feed the soil, having obviously piggybacked to Jerry. And you've heard me tell this story. That book that Jerry wrote that's over my shoulder here, when he wrote it, he asked me to read it. And I said, sure. And I read it, and he said, so what do you think? I said, you can't publish it. And he goes, well, why? You don't like it? I said, no, I think it's brilliant. The problem is that everything that I've ever said and done is in that book, and I'm going to look like a fraud because, I learned what Jerry taught me. But the adage of balancing the chemistry and feeding the soil, I think, is a very valid one, and always has been what we've kind of lived with. And we came up with that phrase very early on. And again, I believe somewhere along the line, Jerry came up with the phrase of biological soil management. And to explain that, what we're saying is that, when you're looking at that three-legged stool, chemistry is a focus in our industries, agriculture, turf. It's always been the focus, pH, all that kind of stuff. Right. Physics, the golf course is a little bit more focused on physics because we aerify, we put in top dressing, and that's physics, right? But biology has always been one of those things that's been a little bit more esoteric, harder to justify. And and really challenging from a academic standpoint, because it's a lot harder to quantify. And I get that. And quite honestly, we're scratching the surface on biological soil management, but we know that biology exists. And thank goodness, after all these years, we're seeing more and more and more information, good information. We talk here about, geophagy and this whole cycle of microbes into the plant, and some of that work that was actually established by folks at Rutgers and others. But it's fascinating. We're seeing more people in the industry using humic acids because they understand the value of the carbon that's going to help to change the physical structure. But by balancing that chemistry and getting the starting point open so that you can get air and water to move through, and then you feed the soil a little bit, that's where the inputs start to get reduced. That's where fertility starts to stabilize. That's where, a superintendent can go home at night and sleep. And this is all coming from 30 years of watching the Kevin Hicks of the world, discover this for themselves and realize, wow, I can sleep at night. I'm not going to walk in tomorrow and my property is going to be on fire or everything falls off that edge and I'm in serious trouble. I can get through there. My grass will stay dormant longer. One of my favorite criticisms of carbon-based fertility has always been, oh, these products won't work until June when the temperatures warm up because it's all microbial, and then it'll all kick out at once. There's a consultant around us that loves to tell superintendents that if you put down organics, you're going to have disease and death in June when the temperatures warm up and all this stuff kicks out. And it's like, that was relatively news to me recently. And I'm like, what? And we realized that, this is an old adage that came out of academia years ago. The reality is that in a good, biologically active soil, which is what we're trying to promote, these soils warm up quickly because biology is energy. So our properties, and we've got some great documentation on this, our properties are some of the first to green up, and some of the last to go dormant. So biological soil management is not much more than trying to promote the native populations, of which we may have cataloged 5 or 10 or 15% in the soil. So yeah, it's kind of hard to wrap your arms around it when it's so difficult to quantify, qualify, and not a lot of academics are paid to study biology, but that's changing. The industry is changing. People are discovering, and long after I'll be gone, hopefully the model of biological soil management continues, because it's, again, never failed. It's never failed in given an opportunity to do its job.
And I think the important thing that sometimes we miss in the turf industry is the fact that all of our inputs are reliant on soil biology to become available to the plant.
Microbes eat at the table first.
It doesn't happen magically. Yeah. It's those biological entities that are breaking everything down into a plant usable form.
Well, look at, and again, I'm not going to criticize anybody because I think everybody brings benefit to the industry. But in the 90s, our liquid fertilizers went from water solubles to some of these really good, super clean liquid inputs. And from a marketing standpoint, they realized that they needed to, step above. So they came out with this idea of foliar feeding. And the reality is that when you got a blade of grass that's 1/8 of an inch tall and you're putting down anything in 2 gallons of water, how much foliar is really there, as opposed to, how much of that 2 gallons is actually getting into the root system or getting into the soil. Sure. And now it's being addressed by microbes. I'm not suggesting that any of these products are bad. Good, clean fertilizers are always good. But the reality is, and Jerry taught me this early on, and it took me years to understand what this phrase meant, but microbes eat at the table first. Everything goes through nitrification. Urea isn't taken up by the plant. It's broken down by the soil, microorganisms, into plant usable forms that the plant can take up and utilize effectively. But all of that's done by microbes, and they need energy, just like your truck needs gasoline to get down the road. If that energy, if you're just constantly using the gas in the truck and not replacing it, which is what conventional fertility has really kind of done, is burned out that carbon. I remember when I got into the business, that phrase soil burnout was very prevalent in the lawn care industry.
Mm-hmm.
And what it really means is that, we just took all the carbon out of the soil. In fact, if you study the ChemLawn models, they knew that term soil burnout was real, and they would just move on to other customers, because that's what they were doing, is putting down nothing but urea, not feeding the soil, not replenishing the mineral or the carbon. And so that nitrogen would ultimately not go through nitrification, because there was no gas in the truck to get it down through that nitrification process. And that really, in a nutshell, is biological soil management. And if we get that balanced by starting with the soil, if that's appropriate based on the CEC of the soil, and getting some carbon and mineral in there, systems, the nitrogen that we do use, the synthetic nitrogen we use, which we use in all of our programs and many of our products, works better. And it doesn't burn out the soil, and there's sustainability. And it's, again, it's coming to fruition. Unfortunately, we'll probably be gone, but it'll get it.
Well, there's a lot of universities that are looking into microbiome studies, and like you said,
wow, what a concept.
Yeah, I think they're going to find that it's a very difficult thing to isolate. But it's very encouraging to
well, this goes back to that model, and this is what, this is really, and I remember Jerry having these incredibly frustrating conversations. It's reductionist chemistry.
Right.
So it's taking this big thing and reducing it down to, this is the one thing that made this all work.
Yeah.
And the reality is that we're not dealing in a reductionist science. We're dealing in a dynamic science, biology. Biology is never reductionist, because it relies on the expansion of these millions of microbes. And again, that's what we don't understand. We don't understand what each one of these microbes is really doing, but we know that they're doing something really amazing. And we're learning more and more. I tell this story often. I had a friend who was a chemist, and she worked in a perfume company. And her job was to take this molecule and reduce it down to that one little speckle of that molecule that gave them the scent. And she lived and died by reductionist chemistry. And it's classic reductionist chemistry. And we would have fights all the time, because I'm saying, well, in a biological environment, that doesn't work. I mean, a biological environment is expansive. It's not reductionist. And it relies on the dynamics of that expansion in order for it to truly function. So all we're trying to do with biological soil management is allow the system to be expansive, to be dynamic. And that's why Jerry came in with, his formulas to this day drives me nuts. And I really wish we could get by on 3 or 4, inputs on some of our formulas, like many of our competitors do. He had 30, 40 inputs in each one of these, and it's a bloody nightmare to manufacture, but it was the backbone of what we do. And you've been in these conversations with us now. We're loyal to that concept of dynamics, because it's this expansive, dynamic biological process that is the backbone of biological soil management. And we've got to be able to support that and allow it to grow. And I think you're seeing more and more companies that are starting to see this, more conversations, and anytime you see academia coming out at us with pseudoscience terms, it's just, you're kind of getting on the right.
You're over the target.
And I'm going to get myself into trouble with this, but that's all right. I'm leaving it to you guys.
This is fully relatable to human health too.
Exactly.
Think about what's going on in our gut alone, and some of the things that we've done
biology
to interrupt that, and the health, the poor health related issues that a lot of us are dealing with as a result of that intervention, whether it's through chemistry or through whatever we're doing. But the same thing can be said for the soil.
I think this, but Jerry used to talk about this all the time. When Dr. Albrecht went to college, he wanted to be a medical doctor.
Yeah.
This is in the 1920s. And he realized fairly quickly that being a agronomist can actually have a bigger input medicinally. And a lot of this stemmed from back in World War I. A lot of the soldiers were dying because of the flu, because it was new, and the food system had changed. So the food system had changed back in that time period in World War I. They were making K rations and they were giving them to soldiers, but this was not food that their bodies had ever been used to. everybody grew up locally, eating locally from local farmers or their own farm. farms, and it was whole foods that were rich in minerals and vitamins and all the goodies. And now we started making these K rations that were partial foods, synthesized foods, and and so the whole biological system within their body was changing because the food that was going in was changing. And Dr. Albrecht was studying this and saw that, and as a student became very aware of the fact that, hey, I can make a bigger impact by talking to farmers and changing the food. I mean, if you listen to anything Jerry said, one of his favorite lectures was "Food is medicine." And it, for us, it's, the analogies between what you and I do in talking to clients about getting their soils right to feed their plants is not a whole lot different than talking to your kids about, Coca-Cola and Twinkies is not a sustainable diet, buddy.
Delicious, but not sustainable.
Exactly.
Well,
it's not going to keep you healthy.
Yeah, Dr. Arden Anderson, his place has basically built a career on talking about just that. The fact that if we can get it right on the farm, then we can get it right in our bodies.
Dr. Scow. I mean, these are the people that were Jerry's influences. In fact, Jerry's been involved in a couple of Arden's books. So it was interesting. And Jerry still to this day is one of the louder voices in sustainable agriculture. And his lecture series are good. We did a couple podcasts, I think, early on, where I took some of Jerry's lectures. And I would encourage anybody that has any interest in this, go back to those podcasts that we did, where I took Jerry's, literally took his lecture series on tape and broadcast them on our podcast. And you can hear his message and you can hear it in his words. But, we wouldn't be here without Jerry Bernetti, and we miss him every day. And, but interestingly enough, we continue that message. And I still will say to anybody that the work that he did, and we were talking about this just this morning, the work that he did was so far ahead of what anybody else has ever done. I'm not sure I'll ever understood it or understand it, but I appreciate it and I see it. Could I do it and repeat it? Probably not certainly to the extent that he did. I've learned enough to be dangerous, and working with Lawrence has helped us, but yeah, it's it resonates, and thank God for Jerry.
You were just talking this morning about some minor addition to our liquid product that none of us knew about, and why
but he did.
And why he did it, and it took us probably 15 years to A, to find it, and B, to figure out why it was in there.
Yeah, he was big on fermentation salts, which are now part of all the liquid products. And, and I never understood what that was all about at the beginning, but he did. And, so, I mean, it's just constantly layers upon layers and creating a dynamic environment. So
diversity.
There you go.
Yeah. Man, we covered a lot.
Yeah.
Our hour is up.
I see that.
What are we missing?
Where are we going from here? I mean, I hope that we continue this message. I hope, you young guys continue the message. I mean, that's really what's important with, with my legacy as a company and Jerry's. I mean, I'm trying to maintain Jerry's legacy, and we still haven't scratched it. So we're getting there. And I hope more and more people understand that this, this argument on base saturation is moot. It's not an argument. I also hope they understand that minimum levels of stuff is dangerous. It really is. I mean, it's putting people on the razor's edge. It's basic common sense. Just balance your chemistry, feed your soil, get carbon in there. That's how Mother Nature built this thing. We're going to continue to have that talk. We're going to continue to do soil testing. I mean, we didn't mention Logan Labs and the work that Susan Shaner does every single day, but thank goodness for people like Susan and Bill McKibben, who have been able to maintain this work, and you guys that are, continuing the conversation out in the field, and the guys that we work with. I mean, you know this as well as anybody, been with us for a few years, working with guys that discover for themselves how a soil really works is what makes us go every single day. I mean, it's not about selling a bag of chicken poo. It's about, helping people's careers get better and their lives easier. This is a tough industry. It's a wonderful industry, but it's about helping people discover, what can make their lives better, and helping them do their job better and build better communities because of the green space that we build, and just make it work better. And it's kept me going for 30 plus years. I know you have great passion for it, as does everybody on our team. And it's just a lot of fun working with a guy out in the field and just seeing his light bulb go off and say, man,
exactly.
I wish I'd known this 20 years ago.
Right.
Well, we told you, but that's the enjoyment.
That's definitely a motivator for me, is seeing that light bulb come on
Good.
Or having somebody call you and say, you know what, this was the best summer we've had at this golf course, and it's due to the investment that they're making in their soils.
And that's why we were so excited about having you on board, because you've done this for so long as a superintendent. I mean, I've never done that like you have. Most everybody on our team at least spent some time on a golf course, but not to the extent that you did. And and you being so connected into the industry, people talking to Kevin Hicks on a regular basis with that story is just a great story to have. So it's been fun.
Well, good. Joel, thanks for joining me.
This is as easy it is. That's easy.
Yeah. It's just like our Monday morning conference call.
Exactly. See, we should get more people on this podcast and just have a nice conversation. It'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah. I'll get Kirk Kastner next. So
there you go. That's a good idea.
Put him on the spot.
Let's see what happens.
No, thanks for joining us and giving us a little bit of history and background of the company and Jerry and how that all started. And we're constantly working on bringing new and innovative things to the market, and we're excited about the future.
We got K Vantage coming on soon, so we're going to have our K product, our potassium product, coming on, and we've been spending some more time in the cannabis industry, so folks in cannabis are going to be able to experience the Jerry Bernetti effect. So thank you so much for having me here on the podcast. And I heard that these podcasts are available wherever podcasts can be found.
Is that right?
I've heard that. Yeah.
So,
I don't know if it's true.
Would you suggest we subscribe to the podcast?
That would probably be a good idea. Subscribe to this thing so that people get notification on a regular basis. I think that'd be good. Thank you, Kevin, very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for tuning in.